my veins. Blue and one, I red, white, and blue in my brain. I'm Bulldog born. Bulldog, that's my breed. I was born to follow where the Bulldogs lead.
Welcome back to Inside the Kennel podcast, ladies and gentlemen. And it's great to hear and see you all. Of course, we've got a man who they made a statue out of a pub, 350 AFL games, multiple Vic representation. We've got the one and only Dougie Hawkins. Welcome to the show again, Dougie.
Paul, Matty, how are you, boys? All good?
Hey, listen, Matty.
Thank you, Paul.
Who's Dougie gonna talk about? Who's on the show, and who's Dougie going to share his wisdom about? So who we got today?
Right. So strap yourselves in, everybody, because it doesn't get, in my opinion, any bigger than this. This is a lad who went at number 1 draft pick in 2014 and fortuitously ended up at the Dogs in 1 year later. And it's the one and only Tom Boyd.
Wow.
Yep.
Amazing, Matty, Paul. Amazing story, Tom Boyd, isn't it? His final series in 2016, I thought, over the 4 games was really steady between the first 3 games, and I thought his grand final performance was real good. It was real good. There's probably 4 or 5 guys at the Bulldogs who could have won the Norm Smith medal, and of course Johansson got the medal off the halfback flank of his 30-odd possessions in that grand final. But I just thought the ruck work of Tommy Boyd that day and his marking around the ground. I think he might have kicked 2 or 3, didn't he, in the granny, did he?
Yeah, he kicked 3, Doug, and he took 6 contested marks, 8 marks in total, but 6 of them, were under some serious heat. And, he split packs that day. And, I don't think I've ever heard the crowd roar like we did on that first day of October in 2016. And Tom was just in the thick of, some of the biggest moments.
Yeah, I think it was, Paul and Matty, and what I remember so clear that grand final with Tommy Boyd, I got a feeling the tackle was from Dale Morris when he got Franklin and the ball spilled out. And Tommy Boyd was in the right spot, which can be great for you. And he got the ball, I think it was about 55 metres out, and he hit it in the goal square and it went through. And I just reckon that was the turning point of the game. I just reckon that I felt that we were going to win then. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, I felt that. I almost didn't see a moment after that because I was just pretty much having a heart attack, thinking this was going to happen. So my eyes were just blurry from that moment onward. It was enormous.
And don't forget, boys, he left us with that iconic photograph of him and Toby McLean jumping on his back, which I think is just one of the great iconic premiership photos.
Yeah, it is, Paul, no doubt about it. And, here we are with our club's history. We've won 2 grand finals. And I'm sure, as I just touched on before, that Peter Gordon would say, you know what, it was worth every cent that we spent to get our 2nd grand final. And this boy, Tom Boyd, was a huge part of it. But it was sad to see him leave the club the way that he was. He was flat. He was down. I know if it was mental health, and he spoke about all that sort of stuff. Matty, Paul, you guys know all that sort of stuff that he spoke about. And I would say when we played Melbourne in that grand final only a couple of years ago, he'd have been still playing.
Yes.
And he would have took on Gaunt, and it would have been just a fan. It could have been I'm not having a go at him, the boy, Tom Boyd. He could have been the difference in that grand final.
Dougie was drafted with Bonds.
Well, he's playing, so he's still playing with the Bont. He got drafted before the Bont, did he?
It was the same year as the Bont. He went on the AI.
What number did he go? What number did he go, Matty? Paul, what number did Boyd go?
Boyd went 1.
Where'd the Bont come in? Where'd the Bont come in?
4.
Yep.
Fair dinkum.
Yep.
That was good recruitment by the Bulldogs to get him at 4. I mean,
what a choice! Absolutely. So this is the thing. You talk about pressure. You've got a number 1 draft pick. You've got a huge contract. Everybody wants you to do to succeed, and he did it on the biggest stage ever. And you talk about, Doug, the the importance of great players stepping up in September. You know, if you look at your finals games, you know, you've got 3 best on grounds in the 1985 series to get you across the line to get the best and fairest. You know, best on ground every game. That is the moment, you know, that champions are made. And, you know, despite all the pressure, all the negativity, all the criticism, how on earth was he able to emerge and push through that and do what he did, climb the top of the mountain?
No, yeah, you're right, Matty. Paul, you're right. It's on the big stage when you need to step up, and Tom Boyd certainly did that, didn't he? He really did. I don't know a lot after that. He didn't play a lot of footy after that, did he? We wouldn't have played much more.
There was a lot of injuries after that. He started off the 2017 season.
Yep.
Doug, he started late. I think he had shoulder surgery or might have been back. He had a whole series of injuries. Matty, you probably know more information than me, more facts around that, but had a whole series of injuries that just took away his pre-season, interrupted 2017, that where he really hardly got out there, I think, Matty. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. He played, this is off the charts, he played 23 more league games after that grand final in total, 23. You know, he played his last game aged 22.
Yeah,
It's a tragedy, isn't it, Paul, Matty? It's actually a tragedy. It's a tragedy that we didn't get a chance, and the footy world didn't get a chance to see the best of Tom Boyd. And I love Matty and Paul when you get Boydie on. Ask him about what I said. Ask him about the monetary. You know, Dougie Hawkins believes it brought a lot of pressure and that sort of stuff. I'd love to hear Tom's thoughts are about that. And again, you know, 22 more games after a grand final performance like that, I think it's pretty sad. I think that, but the kid had a lot of things going on in his life, and I still reckon that money's. It's just anyway. Just my opinion.
Well, you know what, and this is the thing, because he's going to be with us very shortly. In some ways, you know, what happened to him and how his career unfolded, it's been the platform of the life direction that it's taken. And he is now an ambassador for mental health. He's an ambassador for positive psychology, and he's able to influence a lot of people. So, you know, maybe this was just the ordained pathway he was meant to take. It's not the one that he probably expected. But, you know, what a powerful person he's become in our society.
But what could he have become, though, Dougie? He was in that grand final, and the way he played football, he was a pinch hitter in the ruck. He was incredibly a big mobile footballer. What could he have turned into, in your opinion, and what did you see of him that you liked?
Yeah, Paul, we probably didn't see him play a lot forward. We seem to have rucked him more because we had issues in our ruck division. Is that a fair call? We didn't probably see him to be able to be playing deep forward one-on-one, even though you don't get a lot of that these days, but still it does happen at one-on-one. I'd love to see him playing a goal square for a long period one-on-one and just keep, you know, let him keep playing game after game and let him rack up 50 or 70 games playing in the goal square one-on-one and see what the result was going to be. I tell you, he's a hard player to match up. He's very good overhead. He's not slow. And we all know he can play. So I'd love to see him play more forward than ruck. But we obviously, with Bevo, he had the ruck in that 2016. But again, boys, you know, I just want to say that his performance in that grand final was outstanding. And you know, and we want to talk about money and all that sort of stuff. He's probably paid his way.
Well, I'd pick him 100 times over if that's the result on the biggest day, and we'll never forget it. So, you know, it's fantastic. And you know what? He's age 26. We've got one list spot available. Maybe
how old are you now, Matty? How old are you now?
26. I'm going to give Sam Power a call and say, hey, if we need a forward later on this season, let's pick him in the pre-season draft. He's available.
He's 26, Paul. He's 20.
Yeah.
He's only 26. So that grand final against Melbourne, how long ago was that? 2 years ago, wasn't it?
2 years ago. It would have been 20.
He would have been a young.
Now. He might be 20.
He would have been a young 24-year-old.
But, you know, Dougie, it's a sliding doors moment. I mean, just imagine if he had stayed on and fulfilled that potential, how our team would look at the moment, or whether Bruce would have come to the club, or whether we could have. There's so many ifs, isn't there, around the fact that if he'd had that longevity and had the passion to play the game and all those other things, And that's what happens in football, isn't it, Doug?
Yeah, you're right, Paul. We would have beat Melbourne up over in Perth. If Tom Boyd was playing at 24, we would have beat him. Trust me on that. Our fight back middle of that second quarter was outstanding, led by the Bont. And our tickets were just about spent because we travelled around Australia. Melbourne had 3 weeks at Joondalup up in a resort, relaxing.
Yeah.
We had a Tom Boyd playing in the ruck as well. Oh, gee whiz.
I love that statement. Well, do you know what? I can hear him knocking. He's coming in now. We're going to ask him about that, Doug, and many more. Thanks so much. And go Dogs.
Great work, Paul.
Well done, Dougie. Thanks, mate. Great work. Okay, folks, welcome back to, ladies and gentlemen, the Inside the Kennel podcast. And we have Bulldogs Premiership alumni with us today. Welcome to the show, Tom Boyd.
Thank you, Paul. I must say, we were just chatting before the podcast. I feel like you've got a radio voice that you put on when you do the introduction. So maybe people don't realise that, but it's very sort of, Dennis Cometti-esque.
It's a very, very good microphone, mate. I've invested $100 in this microphone. It's all mic. I am a teacher, so I present to an audience every day, Tom. So,
welcome, Tom. And speaking of wonderful radio voices and presenting every day, you've got your own regular podcast with Danny McGinlay. Danny Boyd, it feels a little bit like we're cheating on Danny today, having you on the show, but you're just like Lin Jong was welcomed to the Collingwood facilities in 2016 mid-season. You are absolutely welcome, sir, to join us today. And dog fans, if you haven't tuned into Danny Boyd, highly recommended show and talking all things Bulldogs.
And having said that, I noticed from reading your book, you had some very good Year 12 results. So your high-end stuff there, buddy.
Yeah, I was really funny. I remember going through childhood and my parents were like massive on education and they could feel their grip of control slipping as the years went on. And I started getting closer and closer to being drafted. But going into Year 12, I remember having the conversation with mum and dad. So essentially you do 6 subjects. Often you do 1 in Year 11 and then 5 in Year 12. And I was going into Year 12 and I was like, I don't have the time to do 5. So I was looking to do 4 subjects. And that was probably the first moment where I reckon my parents realized that I was, incredibly hardworking, both at my school and my football, and that I was trustworthy enough. Not that they didn't read me the right act beforehand, but to sit me down and actually treat me like an adult and talk to me about what I wanted to do with my life. And I think in no small part, having that extra, 2 or 3 hours of study time a week was fundamental in me getting the good results.
Well, it is. I mean, it's a remarkable outcome considering, I know you got a very high score, considering what you had on your plate, clearly from reading your book. And you didn't really mention anything about your studies other than with your friend supporting each other, but that's quite a remarkable outcome.
Yeah, I mean, it was important to me. It was actually, looking back, probably the thing that I lost most when I was playing football was, when I was going through year 11 and 12, there was one thing that I did particularly well, which was I just balanced everything out. Now, I was a mental trainer. I was training, doing full sessions of gym before the training sessions, then training with the Eastern Rangers or Metro or whoever it was at the time. And then I'd go out and I'd do an hour of goal kicking afterwards, particularly in my Eastern Rangers days. But at the same time, if I needed to go home and study afterwards at 9 o'clock, I would go home and study for that too. And what it, really drilled into me was that I needed to be more prepared than ever. And actually, that's probably the one of the most lingering characteristics that I have is if I know I've got something important that's, you can't be moved coming up, and then there's something important the next day, my ability to prepare throughout the day before and get to the thing that I need to get to in the evening and then turn up and perform the next day really is evidence, I think, of my Year 11 and Year 12 years. But I think that balance piece was just lost during my AFL time, and you just get so little time to spend on extracurricular activities. And I valued my education and my sort of intellectual development very, very significantly, and just wasn't able to do it for the vast majority of my career, unfortunately.
It sounds like perhaps your study was a relaxing aspect of your life, which is a bit ridiculous to say, but would that have been the case?
Well, I think if you just consider the fact that you can work really hard at footy and the results that you get are fairly ambiguous, right? I mean, you would like to think that football's a meritocracy, but there's elements that are at play that are quite, to be explicit, just chaos. So, you get injured or, you have a bad week because your teammates can't kick. And particularly if you're playing as a forward, the destiny of your own performance is not as solidified as it otherwise may be, particularly if you're playing around the ball, I think. So, to have something in my control like education, and I ended up finishing a business degree at Victoria University, and I was studying Monday, Tuesday, Thursday nights, 6 till 9 p.m. So I was doing quite a heavy workload whilst I was still playing footy. And If I tried in that, I got good marks. And if I didn't try, I got average marks. But either way, I could control the outcome that was coming up. And it gave me this, probably quite simply, a great sense of control in my own life and the outcomes that I was trying to achieve.
Yeah, so Tom, we would love to just hear how footy sort of became so important in your life. Obviously, you know, you've had a very tall stature from the early days, and basketball was one of the sort of the early sports that you immersed yourself in. How did they balance out, and how did footy sort of take the priority?
So on the stature front, I grew 27 centimeters in prep. So it was a bit of a shock to most people. But in all honesty, I think what it meant was I skipped the growth issues. Like, I had some heel issues early on, but I didn't have shin splints or osgood or any of the knee patella stuff. I was really lucky in that sense. But look, the two things about football and basketball, the difference is, particularly in Victoria, is football is filled with, expats of the game who love it. And it's a really positive culture. I always found them incredibly supportive growing up, at least in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Look, we were, not a particularly wealthy area, very suburban, had probably come from being a pretty, rubbish place to grow up 20 years before me. But it was always this sort of nurturing and very forgiving if you wanted to go off and play other sports, right? Like, there was a lot of players who wanted to play cricket and basketball, and football would always flex around that. Basketball, on the other hand, was filled with all the expats who had come back from overseas or, had tried to make their way at college level or the Euro leagues or even at the NBL. And they were the most miserable people I've ever met. And all they wanted to do was drill blokes into the ground and crush their confidence, which was a really strange experience. But eventually, by the age of 15, I just missed out on the state squad for the basketball side. So that was Dante Exum's year and Ben Simmons' the year below me. So they were both in that side. And I think I got to pick 17 or something. Essentially, there was 15 blokes who made the side. And then about 4 or 5 months later, I'm named the captain of the Victorian state side. And I think I was doing 11 or 12 sessions of sport a week. It was just mental. And I'd gone to the point where my body had finally started to tell me, hey, you're doing a bit much. You're probably going to need to choose. And 16 is that year, right? Like, year 10 is kind of like a bit of a pivotal moment. Mm-hmm. People often go, why did you choose football, or why was it difficult? And it's very simple. I grew up at the Norwood Football Club in the eastern suburbs. And when I grew up there, it was this disgusting brown brick building that had carpet that looked like it had been run over by a tractor and was covered in cigarette stains and, stubby heads were everywhere. Now, lovable place to grow up, but not exactly pristine. And there was a photo on the wall which was mixed in with the other paraphernalia. So they had the premiership flags, few and far between, to be honest, but they sort of the victories that both the cricket and football club had had over the years. And the black and white photo on the wall was a guy standing there with a cup above his head and 2 VBs getting poured on it. He's like, that's the suburban nirvana. And that guy...
That's what you're aiming for, Tom. That's what I'm going to aim for.
That is success. And that was my dad. So he grew up in Norwood. He went to Norwood High School, played there, played cricket there at different stages, and he won the 1989 Premiership. Division 3, I think, in the EFL. Was captain coach and was a bit of a hero around the place, and a hero to me growing up, and still is to this day. Though don't tell him that. Not that he'll listen anyway. But that's the reason why. And I always knew that football was going to be the path that I'd go down, even if it probably took a back seat for a few years with basketball. But yeah, football was always where I felt like I was most at home.
Tom, we spoke to Jeff Vandermeer. We did a parent inside the podcast with Jeff, and Jeff was wonderful expressing his time with Latham. And it sounds like a very similar relationship regarding your dad, making sure you kick properly. And Jeff was talking about Latham making sure he's clean. He wanted him to be clean. And it wasn't about preparing him for AFL. It was just wanting him to be a good footballer. You mentioned your dad had a great kick. And the way that you'd take out and drill you, and you made that comment that Dad was assertive. He wasn't, wasn't like he wasn't a bullying or wasn't any of those type of things going over, but he was just giving you a lot of time. And it was a beautiful sort of relationship that you have going there with your dad that not all people have.
No, I was very lucky, and I'm very lucky to have a father like mine. Hard at times, no doubt. And look, he came from a tough time. He grew up in Faulkner, and there wasn't a lot of holds barred back then. But Look, his perspective, as you said, it wasn't about bullying. It was about doing something properly. And he could see from a very, young age and his own experience in football that whether you could run or change direction or jump or whatever it was, a lot of that could be catered for if you could kick the football correctly and well. And if you were one of the better kicks, it was, it opened up all sorts of avenues. And so he was incredibly stern on that front to me. And, his history was at the age of 16, Dad did a competition called the Sun Kick. So it was, from what I understand, a long kicking competition. And it was sort of the staged levels as you go through the ranks and you win, eventually you get to the state final, which was at Waverley Park, Vic Park at the time. And Dad kicked 69 metres and came second or third overall.
Was that a torp or a punt kick?
Yeah,
torp.
And he lost to a 17-year-old at the time, Wayne Harms. We still have the newspaper clipping at home, so unless Dad's gone back and doctored it, looks pretty good to me. Seems like an actual story. And for me, it was I was probably, whilst I was a quick developer in terms of height, in terms of dexterity and strength and all that, it took me a little longer. It was probably not until I was 17 or 18 that I really filled out. Though I was heavy at 15 or 16, I just didn't have that fast twitch that comes obviously when you really go through puberty and sort of become a man, if you will. So with me, there was moments in time when I tried the rinky-dink kick around the corner, or I tried, flicking the ball around or whatever it was, instead of just kicking drop punts like I should have been. And Dad would sit me down. We'd go down and practice, and he'd go, "Tom, if you're not going to kick the ball, we're going to go home." And we did. There was multiple times that we went home. He just cracked. He said, "Get in the car, we're leaving."
Tough love.
And that's why, historically I was a terrific kicker of the football, particularly for my size. And, it sort of gets a bit found out once you get to the top level and your legs are really, really tight all the time. But still, technique-wise, I was certainly one of the better players.
It must be tremendously satisfying for your father to actually sit back in that grand final whenever else you played to see that beautiful kicking style.
Well, you certainly had the genetics, Tom, on your side, and obviously the hours of training and sweating with Dad out in the park, paid dividends. So tell us a little bit about your meteoric rise and becoming the #1 draft pick. How was that for you, and the weight of expectation? How did you handle it?
Yeah, look, it was again, I think, for the vast majority of my career, it was relatively unique, if not extremely unique. And I think that's why people find it interesting, and certainly why, particularly when I talk about the mental health side of things, it's useful for people. But essentially in 2011, I was the captain of the stateside, Victoria. Then went over to the carnival, probably 6 weeks out, got injured with my back, and that was sort of right around when basketball had peaked, and didn't play that well. Was really disappointed, probably was a bit unfit compared to what I'd been at the start of the season. And as I'd gone through the trials for 16s, I'd really dominated, and had gone particularly well. And so to sort of get to the carnival and be pretty disappointed with my outcome, not make the AIS team, it was particularly disappointing for me. And then I basically sat down and was like, what am I going to do for the next year? And so I just got incredibly fit, incredibly lean, probably dropped 7 or 8 kilos, got down to under 100 for probably the last time in my life at the age of 16 or 17. And then went out there and played for the Eastern Rangers. And the one sort of hiccup in the road was that we were bloody rubbish. We had about 17 underage guys playing, including me, in that 2012 season. We won 3 games for the year, which was 3 straight games in the middle of the season. But I was lucky enough to get onto the end of a few and actually win the league goal kicking. Played in the stateside. First game up in Darwin, got absolutely smashed, played terrible, dropped my head, got sprayed by Anton Grabak like nothing ever that I've ever experienced before, though I probably got a few once I got to the league. And then got dropped actually and came back for the last 2 games of the year and played really well and managed to be a part of that national championship. And look, I sensed that I was definitely up there with the best players in the country at 17. I would have probably been in the first round thereabouts if they were still allowed to draft at that age, maybe higher, who knows. But what I really wanted to do was leave no doubt going into the start of that following season. And look, to be honest, I set my sights on going #1. It seemed like a good target to have, and it sort of kept me honest in my own preparation that, I couldn't just rely on, being a flat track bully and beating some of these smaller defenders and smaller teams or teams that weren't so good as the Eastern Rangers really propelled into one of the best teams in the competition in 2013. And then about 5 or 6 rounds in, I've played, again, probably 5 games. I've kicked almost 30 goals. And I've just started the year as well as I possibly could have. And then I hurt my ankle over in Perth. And, I was probably on the verge of playing the best game that I've ever played. And I remember going into this game. So in the state competition at that stage, there's essentially like 2 games against Division 2, which don't really count much in terms of the eyes of the recruiters. I think we played maybe in New South Wales and Queensland and beat them both comfortably. And then the first game of the sort of 3-game series is against the other Division 1 sides, which is WA, SA and Vic Country. So the 4, and Vic Metro, obviously. So the 4 teams play against each other. And so I went over there, and a guy by the name of Alir, who obviously has been a fantastic player for Sydney in recent years, he was the fullback. And my coach at the time, Brent Thiel, sat me down before that game and he goes, mate, this guy's really good. He's going particularly well. You're not going to be able to wrestle with him. He's really strong. You're not going to be able to out-jump him. He's really athletic. You're going to have to outsmart him. You're going to have to really use your football now. And at the 11-minute mark of the first quarter, when I hurt my ankle, I was lining up for my 4th goal. And I was pretty confident that I'd worked it out. So the only reason I tell you all that, besides the fact of living through the glory days, is that meteoric rise really stopped then. That was the last moment, except for the grand final in the Eastern Ranges, which is probably 4 months later, that I played that season. Right. But if you consider the fact that in the first 5.5 games or 5.25 games, I'm 33 goals in or whatever it is, averaging 5 goals a game or thereabouts, the sort of legend of my capability just shot through the roof while I was injured, because I hadn't played a bad game. I think I'd kicked 3-7 against Bendigo and they gave my opponent best on ground. And that was like one of the weirdest experiences ever. And then the sort of media narrative after that was Tom would have kicked 5 goals every game for the rest of the year. He would have kicked 130 goals. And it was like, no, I wouldn't have. Something would have got in the way. Like I would have got injured or form, or, the weather hadn't turned yet. It always gets difficult in the middle of the season. But unfortunately, I didn't play again until the end of the season. And then we were lucky enough to play in the last game of the year and win the premiership by 120 points, I think, against Dandenong. So capped off what was, pretty incredible 2 or 3 year stint as a junior player. And incredibly thankful for my time at the Eastern Ranges and the Metro as well.
So you end up at GWS as the number 1 draft pick, and as you describe, as a person who's a family man, very close to your family and your sisters, and suddenly you're extracted from your hometown. How challenging is that for a young 17-year-old to have to go through?
Yeah, I think one of the strangest things moving up to Sydney was just how quickly everything happened. So by way of context, when you finish school, depending on what sort of is your last exam, you can finish earlier or later. And the sciences are kind of the second last ones to do. I think it's like English literature and stuff, which is last, which I didn't do, thankfully. But I finished on a Wednesday, and the following Thursday, I'm standing at the Gold Coast Convention Centre in front of a couple of thousand people, trying to thank the crowd, and really stupidly thought that using a big word in my speech would be funny. So I did that. The word was superseded, by the way. Don't know why. Anyway, I like to challenge myself with very strange things at that age. And the following day, I went to bed at midnight on the Thursday. The following day, I'm up at 4:30 to go and do 7 minutes of television for Sunrise or whatever at Broadbeach. And then that afternoon, I'm back in Victoria. And the next day, we had a few people over to our house, celebrate the Eastern Ranges boys who got drafted, of which we had 3 or 4 that year, I think. And then Sunday, you'd leave to go to Sydney. Close your eyes, 10 days after your final school exam, you're an AFL footballer. And, as much as the stark change in your life is interesting to deal with, and, you're going from being at home to living with 2 knuckleheads who've got no idea how to look after themselves. And of course, you don't either. And you're also trying to juggle this, incredibly different environment to the one that you've come from, right? So if you go from a community footy club, you're going from a place where everyone wants you to do well, everyone wants you to succeed. The job of the Eastern Range is to get as many players drafted as possible. The Vic Metro want them to be as many players drafted from them as well. Like everyone just wants you to do well. And much of the decision-making is predicated on that sort of concept. When I got to the Giants, there's probably 20 first-round picks, if I had to guess, 20 to 24 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't so much about everyone succeeding. It was just working out who could survive. And, selfishly, looking back, it doesn't really matter now that given that I've sort of really found myself in a good place post-footy. But selfishly, if you're a number one pick, you're probably the only one that either they've ever had or that they've had in the last 10 years, unless you're Melbourne and then they just ruin as many number one picks as possible and just keep their revolving door going. No offense, I'm only joking, Melbourne supporters who won't listen to this.
Well, we'll edit that, Tom, don't worry.
No, you don't have to. It's okay. You don't hate me anyway. And for me, I was alongside Jonathan Patton and Lockie Whitfield and Tom Scully, actually. So there was 4 of us. So number one picks were kind of like a dime a dozen at this footy club. And so I got treated like every other draftee, as you expect, but probably didn't, receive any concessions. And I'm not saying that I should have, but that's what happens at other footy clubs when you're a really high pick in particular, because they just want you to succeed. They've invested a lot into you, whereas the Giants have been sort of conceded with so many picks that, draft capital was something they just expected to have for 3 or 4 seasons leading into the time when I arrived. And so I think that sort of competitive nature within the 4 walls of a footy club between teammates was completely foreign to me. And it wasn't to the point, like I went to the Bulldogs 11 months later and it was completely different. It was much sort of, yes, we're going to go hard at each other, but we do want each other to succeed. Whereas there was sort of this young, insecure, very talented, very competitive group of players at the Giants at the time. And I think the football coaching staff, I think, it'd be interesting to talk to Leon about this, but my sense was, looking back, they wanted that. They wanted this sort of scrap between the teammates because they wanted to see who had the sort of edge about them. And they wanted to develop players quickly and make their lives, incredibly challenging to get them to accelerate their growth.
Right.
And I think that was, amongst the actual moving away from home thing, I think that was probably the most shocking change to me.
Yeah, that's fascinating because, the whole concept of team is working together. And I guess that format really just encourages you as kind of the alpha, just saying, how do I, climb to the top and compete against these guys rather than working with, and it's counterintuitive in some ways. So it must have been pretty challenging.
Well, look at it this way, right? So when I first arrived at the Bulldogs, we used to do the Mooloolaba camps, and they still do. I don't think they did this year for the first time, but I'm sure that's a COVID thing. When we used to do the Mooloolaba camps, there'd be 3 main training sessions. So you'd go for like 8 or 9 days. You do the light session when you first got up there. Set the first night, you'd fall asleep. Next day, be main session. 2 days later, main session. And then you do this massive hike to end, which would be like 15 to 20 Ks. On that third main session, particularly in my first 2 seasons, the players would be bluing so hard. Like we'd be wrestling and scragging, there'd be jumper pulling and swearing at each other and cheap shots, because after 8 days at camp, you just want to bloody, rip each other's eyes out because you've been living together for 8 days and you want to go home and see your partner and get some bloody normality back in your life. But that changed drastically, and that only really ever existed in Mooloolaba, right? And so 15 and 16, we obviously finished 5th and obviously finished 7th and win the flag. The existence of that sinister competitiveness didn't happen, not at least to my memory. And I think that's evidence of a club that has its own identity and one that knows who they are. And I think when I first walked into the footy club in 15, I don't think we did, or end of 14, start of 15, when we didn't have a coach, didn't have a CEO, didn't have a captain, didn't have much clue about what was going on. And then obviously Luke came in and things straightened up really quickly. But I think it's really evident in footy clubs that don't know who they are, that they feel the need to, scratch and claw at each other before the opposition. And whilst I think it has a place in pre-season, I think its existence during the year is something that's completely not ideal to optimal performance.
Yeah, well, Martin Flanagan talks about that in A Wink from the Universe, and says when you walk through the doors there, you felt that sense of, hey, there's 100 years of history here. This club's got an identity, and I guess that was very different to what you've just described there at GWS. So walking through the doors, as this incredible trade that I guess divided the footy world of people saying, wow, the Bulldogs have traded their
I don't think it divided people. I think everyone was almost like, what the hell just happened?
Well, absolutely, Tom. I was filled with hope, and this is what footy clubs trade in, isn't it? The concept of a big 200 centimetre number 1 draft pick coming to the club was something very foreign to the Western Bulldogs. So you represented hope for us, and not everybody saw it that way. clearly, and you're one who can vouch for that. But in my eyes, and a lot of people who I know really well, who are passionate about the Dogs, saw this as an opportunity and a real turning point in our history. And as it turned out, that's exactly what it was. Now, you weren't to know what the future was to hold, but how was that, and the weight of what everything was going on? How did that feel?
Yeah, I mean, it was. Yeah, I mean, we underestimated it, that's for sure. I mean, we'd spoken about the fact that there'd be pressure, but I had pressure as a 17-year-old, had pressure as an 18, a first round, number one pick, but I had pressure in Greater Western Sydney, which is pretty, null and void for the most part in terms of the football footprint that's there. So, it was quite shocking, and I think it was evident. Well, firstly, I do like to describe something that most people don't actually talk about, because it is important to remember at this period of time that when I joined the footy club, one of the reasons why the contract was so big was because the club hadn't spent the salary cap in like 6 years. So
Right.
They were, I think, again, happy to be, told that I'm incorrect here, but the rules are that you have to hit 95% salary cap every single season. And if you sit below it for a number of years, eventually you have to pay the fine to not pay your players enough.
Oh,
And so one of the things that my contract represented was that they had to spend a significant amount of money. Now, Bont was under contract. They couldn't pay him. I think McRae would have still been under contract. A lot of those younger guys who were coming through would have all had, deals in place either from their draft years or from ones that had signed as extensions already. And, again, spending money, as you said, on a key forward, and, I can say this objectively, that's young and, promising, is one of the better ways to engage your fan base about your future, because everyone wants a key forward who can kick you 60 goals a year. That's just a matter of fact. So I remember my first, unveiled Tom Boyd moment is we went down to Williamstown North Primary School, and it's one of those kiss the babies sort of moment, one of and do the photo op and a few handballs in the sunshine, wear a polo because, the club has to get their merchandise partners out there. Yeah. And, after that, we did a presser, and I think it was the second question. The second question I was asked was something like, what do you think your trade means for the overall trade landscape, or something to that nature? And I was like, I'm 19, mate. Yeah. I still drive a Subaru. I don't know anything. I haven't got any of this money yet. I'm still under contract. I don't know anything about the, who's, what's, and when's. And whilst I'd been a part of the trade process, I really hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about anyone else but my own deal, of course, as you will. And I think what that marked for me, and I probably only realized that in the process of actually writing the book, is I reckon that was the moment. So if you think about when you draft a player, there's all these conversations about development and progression, and, it takes a couple of years. Key position players take longer. There's a lot of concessions we give to our draftees because we want them to succeed, and we don't want to place too much pressure on them. That's not everyone, but I would say en masse, a large portion of the football media and the football public do that. When I got back to Melbourne, I reckon that whole narrative just went out the window, which was you're getting paid $1 million a year, which, by the way, I wasn't. I was still under a draftee salary for 12 months. But you're expected to perform at the top level now, right, which I wanted to fulfill. And that was one of the things that I pressured myself to obviously do as quickly as possible. And, whilst my career certainly wasn't what I thought it was going to be coming in, and I didn't by any means blow people's socks off on a regular basis, I was still, part of a premiership side, and obviously played a great game at the age of 21. That's really quick to get to that level. But, people have very short memories. And I think, in that sense, the expectation was that premiership was going to be the start of me dominating every single game. And, again, probably not something that's particularly important in the overall story. But one of the things that really threw my career out post 2016 was the fact that the AFL changed the rules with 3 weeks before pre-season. Right. So instead of 2017, me continuing to be a mobile pinch-hitting ruckman who would go forward, which I found my niche in and was doing particularly well in, I now had to ruck by myself because we didn't have a third man up rule that we were allowed to utilise anymore. And lo and behold, you wouldn't believe that, a couple of coaches with big ruckmen decided to voice their concerns 3 weeks out from the season and change one of the fundamental rules of the game. But look, all of these things happen along the way. And, I think, it's no small part the challenges that I faced then are, what helped me now.
No, that story reminds me a little of Ugle Hagen as well, Tom. The same pressure that he received when he came in as number one. Funnily enough, you're the same age, even though you'd been at GWS for a year. Tom, when you were going through that contract process, were you aware of were you in the hands of your agent? I know in the book you mentioned your dad supporting you there, but were you in the hands of your agent? Was he consulting? Were you fully aware of the context of what was going on?
Yeah, and I think realistically, Dad played a conduit between me and Liam Pickering, who was and technically still is my manager. We've been together for about 10 years now. And look, I think there's a danger of me sounding like my dad was overbearing, but Dad had done really well in business and didn't want me to have to deal with the rubbish on the other side of it. And look, I was in every important meeting. I was there and I listened to it all. I was there for the conversations. And by way of timeline, perhaps it's useful for people because I'm not sure everyone realizes how sort of fickle these contract negotiations are. And I basically got contacted, or Dad got contacted by a club at the time, probably around 6 or 7 of the AFL season in 2014. So my first season with the Giants, obviously. And he called me on a Thursday and he goes, "Oh, Tom, you've had a contract offer." And I said, "Dad, I'm not re-signing with the Giants. They'd already offered me a 2-year extension. So I'll be in a 4-year player." It's very common for interstate players in particular. Give them a bit more sort of concrete foundations. And he said, "Oh, it's not from the Giants." I said, "Oh, okay. Who's it from?" He goes, "Tom, I don't want to distract you. You've got a really important game this weekend. I'll come up on Sunday and we'll have a chat about it then." So spent the next 2 days thinking about the contract, played terrible. And then Dad came up to Sydney thinking it was a good idea to dangle the carrot in front of me. And then, at that stage, I was also probably experiencing quite a few issues in terms of comfortability living up there. And so the idea of moving back to Victoria was pretty appealing. So Dad sits me down and he goes, "Oh, this is the offer. It's 7 over 7. I said, $700,000 a year. And he goes, "No, 7 million over 7 years." And I almost fell off my chair. I mean, at this stage, I was 18. I had, I think, three or four games of AFL footy.
Wow.
And the next stage of that is, "Oh, great, how are we going to do it?" So great, like cloak and dagger scene. Go back to Richmond in one of the bye rounds. I'm having coffee with Liam Pickering, my manager, and my dad. And we're at this cafe called Hobbo, I think, which is sort of Bridge Road. And we jump in the car and we do like a little motorcade going to Peter Gordon's underground garage so no one could spot us, right? And that's where the club was presenting. And so Jason McCartney was their list manager, Brendan McCartney coach. I think Simon Garlick would have been there too, as the CEO at the time, Peter Gordon, obviously. I think that's probably all of them. And the club sat me down, and Brendan in particular puts up this big, in Peter's entertainment room, he's got he had a projector in there when he lived there. And it was like the team as we see it now. And it had this grading system, A, B, C, D or whatever. And he goes, "This is where we are now. And this is where we're going to be in 2 years." And like, it was players that I'd played juniors with. And they were like, C grade players who became A grade players. I'm like, Mitch Honeychurch, look, I love Mitch. He's a guy I played footy with since I was 12 years old. He's not going to be an A grade player. He's too bloody small. And Nathan Robat was another one. So there was sort of like this, I'd say, skepticism about them trying to sell me the club. I was like, "You've already sold me. You just offered me $7 million. I don't need a lot of more persuasion after that."
So essentially about building a team around you, Tom. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, and really selling the future of the footy club is something that was solid, which it obviously wasn't, as evidenced by 6 months later, everyone leaving the place. But we got to the end of the conversation. We sat down around Peter's dining room table and, we sort of shot the shit for a while. And then eventually my manager just goes, "Look, boys, so the way I see it, you can trade 2 players that'll get the deal done. Ryan Griffin and Marcus Bontempelli." And obviously Ryan ended up being the player that got traded. And if Bont did, I'd never be able to walk safely in the West of the so, thank God they didn't do that. Premiership or not, if we traded Bont, that's it. And then found back to Footscray. And then they were like, "Oh, well, those 2 are off the table." And so we went back around and sort of got to the end. And then, my dad being the sort of brash man he is, he looked Brendan McCartney in the eye. And, we'd heard a couple of things from players at the club at the time. And he goes, "Brendan, there's a lot of talk about these players. Jason's going to be here for 5 years. Peter, you're on for another 3. He goes, "How long are you going to be here for?" Just staring down the barrel.
Wow.
And he goes, "Well, I'm contracted for another 2 years, so I'll be here for another 2 years." 6 months later, he got booted out the door. Such is the nature of football clubs. And look, it honestly didn't look like the trade was going to go through. We got to the end of 14 and we basically, put the cue in the rack, said it's not going to happen. Too risky to pull the trigger. We're basically going to keep it under wraps for another 12 months. And I actually booked a rental in Sydney to show that I was serious about staying before I went overseas. And then, the rest of the public experience of the trade is pretty well documented. But it was a pretty wild ride. And I did get a text message from Leon Cameron in the middle of it going, geez, Tom, what a crazy few days. Can't wait for a massive pre-season.
And then I was sitting there going, I'm going to have to move to Indonesia to get away from this. Like,
I'm going to have to make that phone call. Tom, tell us about who you gravitated towards when you arrived there. Who came, Dougie Hawkins talks about when he first arrived at the Bulldogs when he's a 17-year-old and the legends of the club embraced him and reached out to him. Who was your friends and how were you received when you arrived there for the first training session pre-season?
Yeah, I mean, so when I first turned up, I just had my appendix out, which funniest introduction to Victorian football media. I get my appendix out probably 3 weeks before the preseason starts, and an article gets written saying Australia's most expensive appendix.
Remember that? Yep.
And I turned up and I wasn't in that good a shape, to be totally honest with you, because I hadn't trained, hadn't been able to run or do anything. You're basically told to stay pretty relaxed for 2 or 3 weeks in case that you basically tear your internal stitches. And so I spent a lot of time in rehab. I wasn't specifically injured, but I had a lot of work to do on the injuries that I'd had. And I remember the two guys who were in the first sort of few weeks were really great to me was Stewie Cramery and Kobe Stevens. They were living together in South Yarra, and I was living there too with a teammate of mine from Vic Metro, Nick Floston, who plays for Richmond now. So they were really great. And after probably 3 or 4 weeks, me and Mitch Wallace hit it off. And Mitch was just the best man at my wedding. We sort of were thick as thieves. I think we just had a great affinity for things outside the game as much as anything. A lot of similar interests. A lot of that included going to bars at that stage. But since then it was more so around the business life that his father has lived and mine too, and sort of just trying to learn from each other. And we built an incredible rapport over a long period of time. So Mitch was the one that really we hit it off. We spent a lot of time with Bont too. He's my age. Mitch Honeychurch was obviously a guy I'd known, Ace Cordy and Zane. Yeah, there was a lot of guys. And look, we had a great group. I mean, there's a lot to be said about that 16 premiership. But I tell you what, there's never been a footy club I've been a part of where the team from, number one guy on the list to 40, 45 or whatever it is that were close or as close as we were. And I think that showed. I mean, when we dug deep into our list, we played 39 players that year. There was 39 guys who were willing to step up and play for the team. And, you take it for granted when you look back, but, how many clubs in the league can say that at the moment that they're 39 players deep, maybe 1 or 2.
Was that something Brendan had already developed, or was that something that Bevo took to a new level when he arrived, Tom?
Yeah, look, I can't say on the Brendan front. I mean, clearly the foundations of the team were there. I think that's evidence in both the list building, which obviously Jason McCartney was a big part of, but also the development of, I'd say, a core nucleus of players who were young, consistent, and clearly dedicated performers, which I would say is attributable to Brendan. I didn't spend a single day. Brendan got sacked before I got traded. And I think Luke's, there's a lot to be said about Bevo, and there has been a lot said in the last years. But the one thing I will say is I've never seen anyone turn a business of 250 people, from players to administrators and coaches and the business department and, membership and the whole sort of conglomeration of people that are involved in the workings of a footy club. I've never seen anyone turn them around so quickly. And Bevo had his fingerprints on all of it. So, I'll never forget that. It's something that I think is, quite astounding in his capabilities. And I think that it's for us to basically, buy into the fact that we were fit enough, we were healthy enough, we were capable enough. We just needed to learn to play footy together. It was an incredible 2-year run.
Yeah, it certainly was, Tom. And, 2015 was, we'd come from one of the very, very bottom of the ladder, and suddenly we were contenders. And, we played an incredible game in that elimination final in 2015. You weren't a part of that, but, sitting along the sidelines, I guess you were probably thinking this is a special group and there's potential here.
Honestly, not really. And I think this is probably a little bit of my own immaturity. And look, again, I'm comfortable talking about my shortcomings now because I feel like I've dealt with a lot of them as you grow up. But, I was sitting there, and this happens to a lot of players. So don't think obviously that I'm the only one, but a lot of players, if they're not playing the AFL side at the end of the year, they can't wait for the year to finish. Right, they're sitting there going, "I'm in the VFL's done. I could be on holidays." Unless the team feels like they're going to win a premiership, and even then, there's I guarantee there's some boys who obviously didn't play in the 16 grand final or the 16 premiership who feel like, there's some negative emotion attached to it, because it's you don't get the opportunity often, and it's really can be quite traumatic for the players who feel like they should have been out there.
Yes.
And likewise for me, I felt really quite frustrated towards the end of 15. I played some good footy towards the end of the year in the VFL, but Jack Redpath and Stewie Cramer were playing better, and they were playing good footy at the league level. And so I wanted to get in the side. I felt like I'd put a pretty reasonable hand up to say that I was close, but the players in my positions were playing good enough to keep their spots, and they rightfully should have. But, I think the optimism didn't come until after that game, until after I started to actually cast my eyes to the next year and the ability for us to all do something together and start afresh and all that sort of stuff. But undoubtedly, I would say the bitterness or the frustration and disappointment of not playing in that game drove me to get incredibly fit that off season. It was probably the fittest I'd ever managed to be, even with a shoulder, Rico looming into 16, just to get out there and try and build my engine. It was, the negativity is not always good, but it certainly drives some outcomes at different stages.
Yeah, well, I remember, the start of the 2016 season, you played in one of the NAB or preseason games against Collingwood. And I just remember you running with a fly to the ball and just taking this enormous, hanger, this contested mark in the goal square. And, just 6 months later, you'd be, on the MCG, pretty much turning it on in the same fashion. Tell us a little bit about 2016 and how that incredible campaign unfolded, Tom, and some of your really biggest highlights.
Yeah, so I'd gone through at least from my individual point of view, I'd gone through pre-season and I played some really strong footy. And look, one of the misinterpretations I think I had was that, pre-season hadn't mattered a lot when I was a junior. Like, it was important to get fit and try your hardest, but the preseason warriors, they were a dime a dozen. There was hundreds of them across my junior career, and they never ended up being any good. But in the senior level, performing at preseason scratch matches, training, simulation, all that sort of stuff is incredibly important. And so in 16, I worked out how to do that and actually performed really well. And then it was in Ballarat, I think, for a 5K session that we were doing up there. I think we were doing clinics or whatever. Marcus Adams just jumped on me in a session that we were not really doing contact. No hard feelings, obviously. I think Grizz is a great guy, but smashed my shoulder, comes out, dislocates. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Like, I've worked my absolute butt off to get here, dealt with all of the rubbish of the year before. And then I realized I have to have another 4 weeks off, and then played a few games to start the season, had another 6 weeks off, and then really found my groove post probably round 15 or so. And, I think the weird thing for me is in 2016, the recollection of our side was that we were came from nowhere. And the only reason that's the case, I think, is just because we had so many injuries leading into the last 5 rounds of the year, not because we weren't able to compete. We'd beaten almost all of the top sides. And I think if we'd won that game in Freo, if I'm not mistaken, or if we'd won the last 2 that we should have won, we would have finished 4th.
Right.
But we didn't, and we played in Pab's last game, and they were never going to lose that. So we sort of got to that stage, and then, I think my interpretation of going into those final series, and it's easier to say in recollection than it was at the time, was that, we could beat anyone at our best, and I was confident that was the case. But we were really sort of being held together by Band-Aids as we went through that final series. And, I remember the last game of the year against Freo, about 20 minutes into the first quarter, I go back sort of trying to take a mark over my shoulder, land awkwardly, do my ankle. Pretty bad, and an ankle that I had the issue with since I was 17. I go into the rooms, they jab me up, strap me up, get me on the sidelines, and I'm running next to all of these wonderful Freo fans, which are a bunch of bloody scumbags. And I
don't hold back, Tom. Don't hold back.
Oh, mate, they were at Subi. You're so close to them. They were ruthless, those bastards. I tell you, Adelaide, I was bad too. I got it everywhere. Don't worry. I don't discriminate. And I was running up the sidelines, and I was sort of, change direction, which I really struggled with, try to jump, try to sprint. And anyway, we go back, and Chris Bell, the physio's on the phone to the coaches, and he goes, he can't run, he can't jump, he can't change. What do you want to do with him? They're like, put him in the ruck. I spent the next 3 quarters rucking against Sandal. And it was just a crazy, I felt like at that moment, that's a really formative part, I think, of my finals campaign, where I think that the easy way for me would have been to sit out. I've got a crook ankle, rest up, got a final, feel like I've solidified myself in the team. But the right thing to do was try and win that game. And we needed momentum and we needed some players, including myself, to get through and to try and sort of show their mettle. And that was, I'd say, incredibly formative part. But then things didn't seem to go right for us from there. I mean, we flew over to Perth early. A few of us guys had been injured. And obviously, it was much is to be said about this bye round that won us a premiership. Having said that, we'd come from a Sunday to a Thursday game. So it's the shortest bye round week that has ever happened in the history of the AFL. And we go over there and there's probably about 8 or 9 of us, all guys with soft tissue injuries or, injuries with our ankles or knees or whatever, anything that could have swelled if we went on the plane too late. And the players won't turn up. Like we're sitting there waiting for the rest of the team. It's 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, the day before a game. They don't get in until 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. So we go down and train in the dark at Trinity Oval next to the hotel, as opposed to going to Subi and actually seeing where we're going to play the next day. Like nothing could have gone worse. We had our team meeting at like 10 o'clock at night.
Wow.
And still we managed to get up and win that next day. And it was, just an incredible start. And I look, from there, I just didn't feel like we could lose. There was some intrepidation undoubtedly going in towards the prelim, and I made the distinct error of telling people that I'd had a sore shoulder to Emma Quayle, a journo that I'd really respect and admire over a long course of time. So, as is well documented in that game, Shane Mumford punched me about 55 times before the first. So,
you didn't put the bandage on the wrong shoulder.
No, it hadn't been I don't think it had been. It didn't get invented until the next day. That's when they worked it out.
Tom, can you put? I know this is. You're a very articulate person. Can you put one word of that? What was the magic? What's the word that got that team to win four finals and win a premiership? What is it? It's an extraordinary story. Was it youth? Was it an infinite belief in themselves? Was it a series of events that happened that brought you together? What was that magic?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be closeness, solidarity, connection, like one of those words, one of the words that describes just how much we cared about each other at that stage. It sounds wishy-washy, but that's what gets finals done. I mean, I look back to last year and, within 10 minutes of the first bounce last year, the Swans seemed disjointed. I'm not saying they don't care about each other, but to win a grand final, you have to be so on the same page. Think about Richmond, think about Hawthorn, Geelong, any of these clubs that have won finals in recent years. They are on the same page, and all their players are bought into an idea or a team concept or each other, often all of them. And that's what we did. I mean, we just played football the way that the Western Bulldogs, and we defined a significant style in the game that didn't exist up until that point. Obviously, something that Bevo brought in. I don't think anyone could have beat us, to be honest.
At that time, Tom, was that a feeling akin to when you're back at your local footy club? Did you have a sense that this is right? This is what a football club should feel like?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it didn't require a lot of thought, which is good, right? Because even at the top level, for the amount of analytics and stats and game planning and concepts and design and all that sort of stuff, the game is the game, and instinct wins every single time. But we didn't have a lot of thought process behind it. I mean, I remember periods of time where, Matty Boyd would get the ball, and before he'd marked it, I'd be on the wing because I knew the ball was coming out the other side. Before Bonte got the ball, I knew that he'd be swinging on his left, so I'd be leading. Or I knew that Jordan Roughhead would like to kick a long high ball to the key forwards. Great, I'll stand and deliver. Like these little nuances you have with your teammates are what define great teams, because the element of surprise is always there if you know your teammates better than the opposition do. Yeah. And I think that's the magic of what great teams are like. And I think, undoubtedly in years when either we or any other club haven't gone that well, you can tell that they're not quite on the same page. They miss a kick here, they, miss a handball there. And it's because they haven't got that magic that requires that the best teams do. And we had that year.
Yeah, beautifully said, Tom. Now, this takes us to the grand final. You, in your book, and Bulldog fans, if you've not purchase yourself a copy of Nowhere to Hide, do yourself a favour, get it, have a read of it. I'd like to sort of borrow a line from your very first line in the book, and you describe yourself as a titan when you were sitting on the MCG at the end of that game.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole day was pretty surreal. I mean, I'll never experience anything like that again, to play in front of. No, why didn't they just round up? 99,981. What a bunch of spuds. Give us 100. Just count the players.
Count the players. It's 100.
You shouldn't have done methods at school, Tom.
But just round up, right? Anyway, big bugbear of mine. It was such a surreal day. And look, I mean, I've spoken to other players, and for whatever reason, I didn't feel like we were ever going to lose. And, to start the game, I remember the first vivid one is like, and people have asked me about this, they go, oh, you look nervous when Bonji sizzled that ball on you on the wing. I'll tell you, I'll deny this to the day I die. That ball was going like this, snaking its way about half the ground for 40 metres. You try and catch it, right? It wasn't nerves. It was just the fact that Bonji kicked the absolute bejesus out of it. Now, he denies that, so, believe who you want. Doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But even from that first moment, I mean, as disappointing as it was to not mark that ball, I felt comfortable for whatever reason. And I loved playing at the G. I don't know why, but I always felt like football was more natural for me in the open arenas than it was at Etihad.
Yes.
And, sure, I mean, I think, one of the defining moments is kicking that left foot snap. That really got me, obviously, going. I couldn't see any daylight, couldn't imagine a better way to start a grand final than to kick a snap on your opposite from the absolute pits of the pocket. But in regards to the final goal, I mean, I think all of us were a little bit out on our legs. And, I think in some ways, if you were, trying to teach a kid a lesson about what's important in the AFL, as I mentioned earlier, as a key forward, you're expected to obviously get up the ground, defend. The only reason I was where I was because without thinking, I'd mindlessly tracked up the middle of the ground as a way of defending, because that's what we were supposed to do. So by the time the ball sort of sizzled in and out of 50, and then obviously Callum Moore, I think it was, tried to kick it inside to Buddy, I was right where I was because that's where I was supposed to be as a defensive player, not as an offensive one.
Right.
And to this day, I don't recall a whistle going at all once that ball dropped. I mean, think about it. The only thing that I thought was that I knew that if I was going to kick the ball as far as I was out, any time that I kicked further than 50, so if I was going for my sort of max 60, 65, the ball would, instead of swinging right to left, would always swing left to right. So it'd sort of do this snake and always end up straightening back out. So I almost kicked it at the left-hand point post around my body. And as soon as I hit it off the boot, I was like, this thing is going miles. And, again, to this day, the commentary is, it was a lucky bounce. I'm so surprised, given how hard I kicked it, that the ball didn't just rocket through.
Right.
Almost just to create the anticipation and to add to the poetry of the whole scene, I think.
Oh, look, I was behind the goals there, and I've never seen any event just explode like it did. So I couldn't imagine what it felt like for you to be, every single eye in Australia watching that moment.
I was more concerned, Tom, around your shoulder when Toby McLean tried to leapfrog you, mate.
He was probably 70 kilos soaking wet back. And I've told this story before, but the craziest thing about that whole thing was that, I thought I was going pretty well. It was a pretty good moment. Might celebrate a bit. And Liam Picken, being the wise old head, came over and started abusing me. He goes, Tom, the game's not over. Catch your back. This is my moment. Give it to me.
Yeah. Looking back at it, Tom, do you appreciate the gravity of that moment and where it stands in our history?
Yeah, I think only because of the engagements and interactions I have with the fans, right? I mean, it's very hard to encapsulate the sort of experience of the Bulldogs supporters, and particularly being a player of the Bulldogs, to others who are, whether they're AFL supporters or not. And I think the real sort of essence of it is that it's Footscray is a poor suburb. It's been a poor suburb for a long time. I'm sure it's changing now, but the history of the Footscray Football Club and the cricket club that it came from is not particularly riddled with success. And a lot of moments it was administration and bankruptcy and mergers and relocations and you name it, right? The club was never supposed to succeed. And so for that suburb to wrap their arms around that place and keep them alive for a long period of time. And they're obviously the supporters who live outside of the suburb as well. But that's why it's so special to people. And you're never going to get that at a club that is, hugely commercialized and filled with corporates. Or we don't have corporates. We just have supporters. And a few that have made a few quid over their years. But in earnest, the relationship is the everyday fan at the Bulldogs. And to provide something for them as part of that group, that, you know, they come up and say, thanks so much. You know, never thought I'd see that before I died, and now I can die happy. That's the magic of Footscray, the magic of football, I think.
Yep.
Well, there you have it, Bulldog fans. You know, what an incredible journey, Tom. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for sharing that with us. But, you know, what you achieved in 2016 was nothing short of phenomenal and will never be forgotten. So thank you. Have you got a final message for Bulldog fans and a message of how you'd like to be remembered?
Maybe not so much in how I'd like to be remembered, but I think, you know, football clubs and the history of them is only as remembered as well as the people that continue to tell the stories, whether they're the stories of the players, as, you know, I've just done then, which, you know, we've got many players who've got much more interesting and long developed stories than mine. But those stories that we hear, they're from fans, are from the ex-players, and the broader football fraternity are what keeps the memories alive. And look, I'm really proud to have been a player for the Bulldogs, and proud to continue to call the Bulldogs my club. And I can't wait to see what they have in store for us in the future.
Well said, Tom.
What wonderful words, Tom. Spoken with such authority and class, just like you played the game. And you're one of 40 Bulldog players to have a premiership medallion. So it really is serendipitous that a man born on the same day that our great Teddy Whitten was laid to rest, that you became a Bulldog and delivered on the ultimate stage. So, Tom, thank you very much.
And thank you very much for being on board. That was a wonderful interview, and the best wishes for the future for you.
Thanks so much, Tommy.
Thanks, Tom.
Red in my heart, white in my veins, blue in one eye, red, white, and blue in my brain.